Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where we refute the YouTube atheist rationality rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is going to try and prove he has a brain. Let's begin.
Likewise to most theological arguments, there are many types of arguments from consciousness, each differing in the premises they use and the way they're conveyed. But in this video we're going to focus on the most popular type, that being arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can. So, to present this argument in its syllogistic form, it is a fact that human consciousness exists. This fact can be adequately explained within a theistic framework, i.e., one which posits God's existence, whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a naturalistic or materialistic framework, i.e., one which lacks a belief in God's existence. Hence, there is a fact that only theism can adequately explain. Therefore, God exists. To take on this argument, it's critical that we first define what consciousness means, and preferably within 10 hours. But jokes aside, its basic definition is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, which is indeed what most of us mean when we say consciousness. But the reason this needs to be nailed down immediately is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not, such as a transcendent part of the human personality. And in doing this, they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness, which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question.
That colloquial definition of conscious he gave is not the definition of consciousness. That is the definition of conscious, to be awake, the state of being aware and responsive to one's surroundings. That means to be awake, conscious, not consciousness. One of the definitions I have for consciousness is a sense of one's personal or collective identity. Now that's not a great definition either, but it's a lot closer than what he gave. And trying to say that there's a theistic definition of consciousness really sounds like he's the one backhanding, begging the question. Also, I don't think I agree with that definition either. A transcendent part of the human personality? I would prefer he elaborate on what exactly he means by that, but I don't think he will. Then he says we're trying to smuggle immaterial properties into consciousness. Consciousness is immaterial. You cannot hold someone's consciousness. You cannot pour it in a glass. You cannot eat it. It is immaterial. Now on to that syllogism he gave. At this point, I will remind you that he made this syllogism himself, so any errors in it are most likely his own. Mainly, he's generalizing it. But when this argument is used in debates, it's usually between two people. But we'll get into all this when he covers it. I would define consciousness as the mind, or a person's mental essence.
Hence, however one defines consciousness, they must first acknowledge that every shred of evidence has so far supported the statement that consciousness is a product of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that our consciousness is independent of our bodies. None.
You actually haven't supplied any evidence that the consciousness is a product of the mind, or that the mind is a product of the brain, and it's not a question about our consciousness being independent of our bodies. It is about the fact that immaterial entities cannot come about by material processes. What chemical reactions would I need to create consciousness in a puddle? I guarantee you, if you make a brain from scratch, and by scratch I mean without DNA, unless of course you want to make the DNA from scratch, but you will not be able to give that brain a consciousness. At best, it'll just be another computer, just an organic computer.
In my opinion, the first objection to be stated is that premise 3 doesn't follow from premise 2, making the entire argument a non sequitur. Even if we were to assume that theism can adequately explain consciousness, and that naturalism can't, it by no means follows from this alone that only theism can explain consciousness. To name a few alternatives, deism and pantheism can both explain consciousness within their frameworks, and so right from the outset the argument from consciousness isn't coherent. its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises even if they were all valid, which so far as arguments go is pretty damn pathetic. But while we're on the topic of alternative worldviews that can explain consciousness, the fact that the argument from consciousness posits only naturalism and theism as valid options, without justifying why these two options are the only available, means that it commits a black and white fallacy. Furthermore, and by extension, this also means that the argument hasn't fulfilled its burden of proof. It hasn't substantiated the claim that only naturalism and theism are valid options.
Oh, he really likes his black and white fallacy. But of course, he's the one who made the syllogism, so the problem of it being too general is on him. Yes, deism and pantheism may both have answers for consciousness. However, when using this argument, the person using it is not arguing against a deist or a pantheist. He is arguing against a naturalist or a materialist. And since both parties agree that both of those beliefs are wrong, then they are irrelevant. Also, all of those views believe in God, a god or gods. Either way, the conclusion would still follow from the premise. Therefore, God exists. It does not specify which god or how many. So it is not a non sequitur. So apparently he cannot even burn down his own straw man. Though to be fair, his syllogism wasn't that bad. Actually, the more I think about it, the more I think I probably didn't even need to throw any shade on it. But who knows, maybe something he'll say in the next few clips will change my mind.
A third flaw to raise is that even if the conclusion of the argument was valid, all it would prove is that theism alone can explain consciousness. It wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a specific religion is true. And as Christopher Hitchens once said, even if you've established deism, you've still got all of your work ahead of you to be a theist. Hence, even if it was valid, the argument from consciousness doesn't remotely support a specific theistic religion.
It's almost as if he knew how I would respond to that last clip, which just goes to prove he's really just trying to throw as many reasons to distrust the argument that he can, and hoping that at least one sticks. And so what? So what if I just established deism? That's still more than atheism. Atheism is like being in a boat with a hole in it, and someone comes by with a working boat and says, "You've got a hole in your boat." The atheist realizes, "Oh yeah, I do have a hole in my boat." So the theist says, "Hop in my boat, you can come with me." And the atheist says, "Why should I? You're not on land. You're in the same ocean I am." Completely ignoring the faults in his own worldview, he will throw mud at the other worldviews just to attempt to hide the faults in his own. If you think I established deism, then instead of being an atheist, you should be a deist, at least. It is not rational for you to claim that deism is proved, but still claim to be an atheist because theism isn't proved.
A fourth spectacular flaw that the argument from consciousness commits is a giant argument from ignorance. If we cut to the core of what's being asserted, it's essentially that because we can't explain consciousness from a naturalistic framework, which, by the way, we can, theism must be correct. Or put more directly, the argument from consciousness is founded on the statement that we don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God.
Incorrect as usual. We all knew he was going to bring out argument from ignorance. He loves that one. Anyway, we do know how to explain consciousness. Of course, he's begging the question too, because he should say that we don't know how to explain consciousness materially or naturally. It's not that we don't know how to explain consciousness naturally. It's that we do know that it's impossible. As I said before, physical, natural processes cannot create immaterial entities. In fact, material subjects cannot affect immaterial subjects. The immaterial can affect the material, not the other way around.
A fifth flaw, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection. At the risk of boring you through repetition, natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, The nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings, and consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings.
A very interesting flaw in his argument is that it implies that evolution is goal-oriented, as if it's deciding to evolve systems a certain way. Keep saying this evolved to do this or evolved to do that, which it would be fine for him to believe that way if he was a theistic evolutionist. And of course he glosses over how any of these things could have evolved. He's giving the why, but not the how. For instance, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. But how would evolution know to do this? It wouldn't, of course, because evolution is not a thing that can think, so it can't know. Nervous systems are highly complex. You cannot create them by accident, which, if natural selection is your only means of getting it, is exactly how you would get it, by accident. And I don't see how you can separate awareness and consciousness. They seem almost synonymous to me. I don't think I can even imagine a creature having awareness but not consciousness. Anyway, ignoring natural selection is not a fallacy, it is a feature.
And finally, a fifth flaw that many of the proponents of the argument from consciousness commit is a personal incredulity fallacy. While I implied earlier that all of the proponents of this argument commit an argument from ignorance fallacy,
you didn't imply it, you stated it clearly.
That's not always true. Some proponents will appeal to ignorance and will indeed commit an argument from ignorance, but others won't appeal to ignorance and will instead simply dismiss evolution by natural selection because they can't personally understand it, and hence they'd be committing a personal incredulity fallacy.
We understand evolution just fine. We understand that it is impossible. We are not being incredulous. But at least he admitted that the argument is not an argument from ignorance. So apparently, according to him, if evolution is false, it's a good argument. Or at least it's not an argument from ignorance. Looking forward to the next one, Mr. Rationality.